where common sense meets enlightenment. Conversations around mind, body, and spirit. Each month, a group of wellness thought leaders assemble to discuss topics like rage, wisdom in the 21st century, our mental chatter, and how to build healthy relationships.
Good evening, wisdom seekers. You're listening to the Wisdom Track podcast from the British Association of Anger Management, or BAAM for short. Find us over at angermanage.co.uk, new website actually, more of that later. And you can also find us under the Wisdom Track on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and on YouTube. My name is Steve Beale. I'm a journalist who's undertaken the BAAM program. And with me is Mike Fisher, anger guru and BAAM co-founder, who's joining us from South Africa, where he's traveled this week to single-handedly take on the Omicron variant. Hey, Mike.
Hi. I'm so excited to be here. You can't imagine it.
So are we, Mike. We know that Omicron cannot, they cannot stand up to you. And joining us as well is BAAM's super consultant, Snake Bloomstrand. Snake is a seasoned transformation coach and author who works with veterans, prisoners, and regular folks alike from the idyllic surroundings of the Minneapolis countryside, which we can't actually see today, unfortunately. So, Snake, what kind of level of emotional resilience are you operating at?
Very mercurial, to be honest. There's been a lot going on in my life, and so it's called for a fair amount of resilience, and maybe we'll get into that later. But it's a roller coaster, and in a good way. I'm glad for have done some of the work that I can feel deep into it and not be crushed. So I'm in a good place.
Marvelous. Hopefully you can pass on some of that personal wisdom to all of us this evening. And thanks very much to everyone who's joining us. As you can probably hear, there are people pinging in by the second. But soon we're going to be talking about emotional resilience, which is the skill of staying strong during tough times. If you want to read a bit more about it, you can head over to the blog. I'm going to try and put the link right now in the chat window for the Zoomcast. There you go, effortless. But it's actually a special episode today of the Wisdom Track podcast because we are deep in the middle of BAAM's annual Anger Awareness Week. It's the 21st annual Anger Awareness Week. And this year we're kind of celebrating because 2021, despite the rest of its failings, was the year anger management turned a corner in terms of its public perception. The BBC, for example, launched a celebrity anger management podcast hosted by boxer Tony Bellew, where footballer Wayne Rooney and the comedian Ricky Gervais are among the world famous voices who've candidly spoken about their rage issues there. Moreover, we're not regular viewers of their antics, but we gather the Kardashian sisters have embraced anger management as a way of communicating better with each other and the wider world. And of course, the advantage of anger management becoming cool is that the stigma around rage issues fades a little and people are more prepared to engage with any troubles they might have there, whether they're at crisis point or whether they would just like a bit of education, almost on a sort of self-improvement level as well. Because anger management deals a lot with communication skills and emotional literacy. And some of us have never really looked at that before. And at BAAM, we find our clients are regular people, just like the Kardashian sisters. And it's good to know that the message is getting through that we can all suffer from unhealthy anger sometimes, and that this is a widespread issue, especially right now. And we're going to talk more about coping with challenge in a little bit. Even more wisdom seekers joining the crew right now. Marvelous. So what else is happening at BAAM's Anger Awareness Week going on right now? Well, Mike's been out and about in the media, raising awareness. He's been in the Daily Telegraph, house organ of the anger management community, talking about recent revelations concerning the connection between strokes, so literally bursting a blood vessel. And that article was published yesterday in the Daily Telegraph. I'm going to whack the link in the chat window there. And we'll get that up on the BAAM website soon. Now, furthermore, proof if it were needed that anger management is trendy. Mike was also interviewed by star journalist Clive Martin in the new issue of Style Bible, The Face magazine. How about that? Now, you can buy it in all good news agents, support print media, and we're going to get that article up on the BAAM website too. Slimmed down Adele is on the cover. And last but not least for Anger Awareness 2021 is this keynote Zoomcast we're having right now, where we're discussing emotional resilience, staying focused and calm under pressure, which is something we've all probably had to summon during these pandemic years, plural. So, Mike, maybe you could start by telling us what the difference is between emotional resilience and simply bottling your feelings up and not acknowledging them. The stiff upper lip. What's the difference between emotional resilience and the stiff upper lip?
Well, before I do that, I just want to appreciate you. What a wonderful introduction. Thank you very much.
That's all right, mate. I have all the rich material.
Cool. Well, it was just really nice to see the way you introduced us. Thank you. So the difference between the stiff upper lip and emotional resilience, well, first of all, it's vast in difference. Stiff upper lip for me suggests an individual is emotionally disassociated from their feelings. They spend most of the time in their head and very disconnected from their feelings, thinking that that is the way to be strong and resilient in the world, but it does the exact opposite. So early on, as you know, we were having a bit of discussion. There's an interface, there's an integration between the head and the heart. And so most people who have the stiffer upper lip live in their head. And there's something about balancing feelings with thinking. And a lot of the work that I do in my anger management programs is educating and teaching people to find that balance. So the problem is that if you live in your head, it's very difficult to empathize with others and also very difficult to empathize with yourself. And of course, if you live in your heart or in your feelings, you can often be hijacked and overwhelmed by feelings. So it's this beautiful balance between head and heart. So there's something to be said about the stiff upper lip. It's a fantastic defense mechanism until the defense mechanism eventually fails. And then we land up in programs like I deliver and the organization delivers. And of course, they'll end up in therapeutic alliances or group workshops or reading loads and loads of books in order to find that balance, in order to become emotionally resilient.
And Snake, you work a lot with, for example, veterans, war veterans, male and female.
Yeah.
And, high security prisoners and all kinds of people who, to whom emotional resilience is no doubt relevant. Mm-hmm. What's your take on it there, and what have you learned from?
Well, I think what Mike just introduced fits there as well. Is there's a denial or a shutdown, and what happens is the ability to be able to interpret emotions and value them for what they're intended to do dissipates. With both men and women, regardless of the situation, what I hear a lot is, honestly, I don't know what I feel, or I feel so much I'm overwhelmed. And so finding some equilibrium between those two places, it seems to be the goal. And it's so unique to each individual. that you really need to do that work yourself. And by work, self-discovery. I know there's certain things that set me off and evoke certain emotions. And it's my body communicating to my head and back and forth. It's taken me 70 years to find some grace with that, rather than just pushing it all off to the side or reacting out of impulse. And so, to a certain degree, I see emotional resilience as how much range do we have, both emotionally and intellectually, to allow both to exist. And that's such a very personal thing, depending on our biography and our chemistry and our makeup. And that's another important part, is our chemistry, because the brain chemistry is tied into our bodies, triggers various different emotional responses. And so there's a lot to learn. And unfortunately, many of us have grown up learning that emotions are inconvenient, push them aside, try and avoid them as much as you can. And we're fated to have emotions. It's part of the system. So start out with that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, guys. Mike, you've actually put together a bit of a chart that demonstrates how emotional resilience means sort of taking positive action rather than simply denying it. Shall I share my screen maybe instead?
Yeah, no, I've got it here, Steve.
Okay.
It's not a problem. So just folks, just to give you some background to this this is just one slide out of 72 slides, but this program is developed because organizations who are starting to utilize robotics and AI, their staff members were becoming terrified that they'd lose their jobs, which of course they have lost their jobs. And the idea is to make them sufficiently emotionally resilient in order to kind of deal with stepping out of their comfort zone and facing some of the realities of possibly being unemployed or having to re-educate themselves in different fields. And so we just wanted to use this as a roadmap, and I'm not suggesting it's specific to the presentation this afternoon, but I think I'm pretty much on target here. It took me 6 months to develop as a full personal development program, but I think some of these headings and some of the subtexts are actually fundamental to the conversation directly linked to emotional resilience. I'm not suggesting that we need to break down each of these components and go into them in depth. I don't think that that's the intention here, certainly based on the conversation I've had with Snake. However, it gives us a roadmap, and if we can be able to integrate some of these headings, it could potentially transform our own lives. So we start at the top, and I call it the 6 realms of emotional intelligence, or emotional resilience is more to the point. So the first one that I always have to address within the context of my one-to-one work and often group work is many people who join our programs, their lives have no meaning, their lives have no purpose, and they are completely disassociated from their feelings. That's where I want to start. And then, of course, there's this component, mindfulness, what it means to live in the here and now, not in the future, not in the past. But of course, when you're emotionally unresilient, you'll tend to either live in the past or you'll probably end up living in the future. But the challenge is to live 100% in the present. There's a lot to be said about creativity, and I think creativity is directly linked to imagination and innovation. And so we got to keep those channels, because we have to remind ourselves that there are opportunities out there, but we need to keep our head and our heart open to those opportunities rather than live in a realm of catastrophizing and futurizing. And of course, we have to deal with the stress of the unknown, the stress of uncertainty. And what you'll often find, people who are emotionally resilient, their ability to manage stress becomes very fluid and becomes very natural. And they get very comfortable dealing with their stress. And then, of course, we have positivity. You know, I often talk about the glass being half full or half empty. I don't think it's about half full, half empty. It's about being able to show gratitude. It's about being emotionally resilient and the ability to self-soothe. And what I mean by that is to be able to reassure themselves that everything is going to be okay. What we often do, as some of you already know, we get caught up in catastrophizing and futurizing. And positivity is the antidote. And mindfulness is the antidote to that. And then finally, we have community. It's about connecting, reconnecting, reaching out for support, being able to utilize available resources, and of course, to join, whether it's a men's group or a women's group, a personal development group, whether it's doing therapy, whether it's reading the books, or probably all four. So that's basically the roadmap that we want to use this afternoon, Steve.
Splendid. Thank you, Mike. Snake, what if you looking at the chart, are you seeing anything maybe that you'd like to sprinkle on top?
Well, I'm glad you asked. Yesterday, Michael and I had a talk, and we're looking at the chart, and I looked at the outside, and those are disciplines, remedies, techniques to move through. But I was saying that center should really be an explosion, in that the emotion is triggered by something, some tragedy, some loss, some love affair that gets you wildly emotional. But something happens outside our sphere of interest that triggers an emotional response. I oftentimes use as an example, fear, for instance, to feel fear. And, you know, we all feel it in different times like that. Does fear mean run away? Sometimes. Does fear mean defend yourself? Sometimes. More important, fear means pay attention. So those emotions are signals that alert you to pay attention in countless different ways. And then I wanted to add to that too, that in most of our cultures nowadays, because the dampening down of emotions or the inconvenient nature of it, by dampening it down, what we do is limit our range. If we're brittle rather than resilient, grief, love, compassion, empathy also dampens down. So this isn't a big bag of tough emotions that are hard to deal with. There is that. One of the ones I deal with on a constant basis is anxiety. And I'll wake up first thing in the morning, high anxiety for no particular good reason. And I've learned that it brings me very much into the present, because that's my particular remedy to that anxiety. Discovered years ago that anxiety not only means something's going on for me, not necessarily what I've tagged as the impetus, but it kind of expands what I was speaking to earlier for each of us as individuals. It's about being able to broaden that range of emotional receptivity and informed response to whatever emotion is coming through us at that time. People who are very adept at this come to realize that emotions are somewhat short-term, and if you lean into them, they dissipate in a reasonable amount of time. If you push them back, they're like an angry dog. They just keep coming back, and it prolongs the whole process. So I throw that into the middle of it too, is when we talk emotional resilience, it's about being flexible as opposed to being brittle. You look at a lot of the road rage or anger incidents that occur, it's the brittleness, not being able to respond in a responsible way, or having limited access to the emotions that are going on.
And is that because we sort of run out? Do we get brittle when we run out of emotional resilience? Do we have a finite reserve of emotional resilience? Or is it more like a muscle? Is it more like exercising a muscle and conditioning?
I see it more as a muscle, and certainly not as clinical as that, but I do know the impact of denial. So I was working with combat veterans for a while, and I asked one of them, what happens when you lose a man downrange? What's the process? How do you grieve? And he looked at me like I was from a different planet. And he said, well, when we get back to base, and this is unique to each team, this particular team, when they'd get back to base, they would hold a roll call. And the person they'd lost in battle would be left off the roll call. They'd call his name 3 times and then get on to work. So there was no grieving process. There was no human way of acknowledging the loss, and they just went forward. Unfortunately, that's an issue with a lot of combat veterans, is the ability to grieve loss dampens and becomes inaccessible for many of them. And yet the body and the heart remember and recall. And so when I talk about restricted range or broad range of emotion, one of the consequences is not feeling that entire range. And it doesn't go away. We still hold it in our hearts or in our heads.
So we can feel emotionally numb, but at the same time, those very emotions are working away in the background.
Numb is a way to cope. I don't feel anything, or I don't know what I feel. And I suspect that usually when I'm working with clients is we know what we feel, but we may not have words to accurately describe it. We don't have a language for emotion that's universal, it's personal.
You were saying earlier on, Snake, which I supported, which is, men tend to go numb and women tend to become overwhelmed. I don't think it's gender specific in any way, but right. I do think from my own experience, that's what happens. Mm-hmm. So you can either go from being numb to overwhelmed or overwhelmed to numb. Because of course, when one becomes overwhelmed, one eventually becomes exhausted from the overwhelm that they just numb out. They simply disassociate and disconnect from their mind, body, and their feelings. So yes, I support what it is that you're saying.
And the important notion is that a friend said years ago, God doesn't make junk. You've got emotions for a reason. And I've always liked that. It's how do we use them? To enrich our lives, to enhance our humanity, to connect with others, to love our children, countless different ways. Emotions are there as an asset to an intellectual process. My go-to place for a lot of my life was numb, denial, or I'm fine, I've got it handled. And it cut me off from a lot of those emotions because I had such a narrow bandwidth for emotion. I feared that I would be overwhelmed, so I was striving to be in control rather than just feel what was running through me.
And of course, just to develop on that for a moment, when I think about how often in my life, and certainly my own direct experiences, that I thought that in order to be strong was to disassociate from feelings, because people who had feelings were weak. And that's the way I was brought up. And that is, a classic stereotype. And one of the things I've often had to reinforce, certainly in the work I do, is that actually your strength lies in your courage to be vulnerable. And a lot of people don't quite understand that. But of course, as they enter into the realms of feeling and emotions, they start to realize that actually feeling vulnerable is a hell of a lot better than feeling overwhelmed or even numb.
Yeah.
But just to go back to what you're saying earlier on, Snake, because I think there's something very fundamental. We feel our feelings, but we don't have a narrative for our feelings. Right. Part of the work that I do is introducing that narrative. Mm-hmm. And once my client group starts to embrace their feelings, something happens, something profound profoundly happens, and there is a seismic shift. And so, as you know, from a cultural perspective, we don't ask people how you feel, we ask them how you are. And some of you already know this, and some of you, I recognize who you are, and you've been on my programs. And so there is a big difference between how are you and how are you feeling. Because how are you? Well, you know, I joke about this, but I don't know how I am. I have no idea how I am because I'm constantly in a state of reinvention. But if you ask me how I feel, you know, I can answer that very simply and very easily today. But I think we get caught up in this notion of how are you? And which part of me are you even asking that? Because I have so many different parts of who I am. So there's one part of me that feels confused. There's another part of me that feels overwhelmed. There's another part of me that feels like death warmed up. And I don't even have a narrative for my feelings. Mm. And so I think it's a starting point within the ability to embrace emotional resilience starts at that point for me, being able to have a conversation about my feelings in a way where I feel comfortable enough to communicate my feelings and, of course, express my vulnerability by communicating my feelings. Mm. So some of you already know that a point I make every time somebody asks me, how am I don't go to fine, okay, or right, not bad, could be better. I use that as an opportunity to check in with myself, and I will say how I'm feeling. And if I feel sad, I will say I feel sad. And if I feel hurt or angry, that's what I will say. So it's the beginning of a transformative narrative that everybody in this group today can begin to at least start using. And even when somebody asks you, how are you? And you say, fine, okay, all right, maybe it would be healthy and advisable and wise to also check in with yourself. How are you feeling in that moment? And then, of course, by knowing what you feel is also a way to self-regulate. And part of self-regulation is very much part of the family of emotional resilience. So once I become comfortable with my feelings, I don't have to allow my feelings to overwhelm me. And that's very much part of emotional resilience and, you know, just to reinforce it, in a way of self-regulating. So if I feel sad, isn't it going to be better for me to express I feel sad rather than say fine, okay, all right? Isn't it going to be much healthier for me to be vulnerable and recognize that vulnerability is where my strength lies and be able to communicate that? And of course, people become interested and curious and fascinated. You know, when I say to people, I feel happy, they don't say to me, why do you feel happy? But if I tell them I feel sad or scared or hurt, it triggers their curiosity. Why do you feel that way? And sometimes I'll tell them, and other times I'll say, I'd rather not talk about it. Thank you very much.
So guys, I get myself in a pickle because I feel that I need to express my emotions more. I get told that by those around me. And I tend to interpret that as it's okay for me to moan. Whereas they're not the same thing, are they? You know, just sort of going into venting about how pissed off you are, that's not the same as expressing your emotions meaningfully, is it? So tell someone, you know, an emotional illiterate like myself, what expressing your emotions really means as opposed to just kind of voicing off when you feel pissed off or sad.
Well, what you just said is shorthand. If you went a step deeper into that, what's the cause of the moan? You know, not to process you deeply at the moment, but, you know, there's emotion underneath simply moaning. And, you know, you start with checking in with your body. What's just being questioned on that right now? Do you feel that question in your body? What does the body tell you? Again, here's a place where we haven't developed language to be able to speak with ourselves that way. So it may not have words. And like Mike mentioned before, we may have very different competing emotions running simultaneously. Many of the emotions are linked together like a chain. I know I find, you know, particularly people who have lived a long time in denial and are angry, underneath that will find phenomenal grief and a big tender heart that never had an opportunity to express itself in any particular way. And that's why I say it's so individual, but so the moan, is there an emotion underneath that?
Yeah, there almost certainly is.
Yeah.
And now, friend of the podcast, Dr. Stephen Blumenthal of TV's Joey Essex on the Couch, one of his tropes is that we don't always express ourselves just by talking.
Mm.
And how else can we express ourselves in ways that might build emotional resilience or be a help? I mean, what does Stephen mean by that?
No, we're seeing that in the technological advances that are taking place, and that, believe it or not, people are actually reading facial expressions in a huge way and analyzing it and whatnot. So we've done that from the dawn of humanity, before we even had words. Is eyes, are they angry? Are they soft? Mouth, is it hard? Is it rigid? Is it open? We somewhat unconsciously pick up on all those cues to assist where vocabulary comes up short. And oftentimes they're not aware of that. Years ago, there was a man who, for whatever reason, everyone was always on the defense and accusing him of being angry. And it was his facial expression. When he was concentrating, it looked very much like he was angry. Encouraged and coached him a bit to just shift that facial expression when he's concentrating, and that projection of others that he was angry dissipated. So we pick up a tremendous amount of information by looking at one another's faces and tone of voice and approach and, our body posture, all those different things.
Yeah, that's why I don't mind wearing my surgical mask on the tube, because no one can see me scowling or talking.
And, that's a good example how many people have complained about. And I know, to begin with COVID, I go to the grocery store, I couldn't tell which way people were going by only looking at their eyes with their carts. So there were a lot of minor crashes because we're not picking up the cues that are normally there.
And so, guys, anything more you want to say about the chart, the old emotional resilience roadmap there?
Well, I'll tell you, I want to go back a few steps. I want to just go back to something that I had an insight about, which is not on that map, but it has come up in the conversations we've had here before. So I think either I want to reinforce something or just develop on it. So for me, there is something to be said about developing an internal witness, an observer. And some of you probably heard me talk about this, but one of the things that I've noticed, that the way that I've developed the observer or that silent witness is by being able to communicate and express my feelings in a way that I certainly didn't do as a child or a young adult. And there's something about that, the silent witness dash observer, because I think it's a kind of a combination of the two, that actually does become that reassuring voice, does become that part of me that is able to embrace diversity and difference in myself, and to be able to recognize very clearly what is healthy for me and what is unhealthy for me. And I think that is part of how in my own life I've been able to develop emotional resilience, because there is something to be said about, instead of reaching out for somebody to remind me that it's going to be okay. And the worst case scenario is, you'd have to face the challenge and do whatever you can to come to terms with what this challenge or this presenting problem creates inside of you. But having that part available to me, it's almost like the closest I can get to it, it's like having a wise uncle in my head who is able to kind of give me some kind of reassurance or even answers, while the other part of me is in a state of overwhelm or in a state of crisis. And so from my perspective is that I can reach out because I have the choice to reach out and ask and get support, or I can find my own way, being able to identify a solution to whatever the crisis is by being able to reassure myself that it's going to be okay, or I'm going to be able to recognize how to manage whatever curveball life throws at me. And of course, I have that extra support by reaching out to my community. So I think that's a piece that you and I haven't actually discussed in the conversation we had yesterday, Snake, but I do think that's a very important element to what we're discussing when it comes to emotional resilience. And of course, I wonder, Snake, if you can develop on that and add to that.
Yeah, what comes up for me is a certain amount of this is life experience too. You face something unfamiliar for the first time, it's frightening, it's unfamiliar. And you do it twice, it becomes less unfamiliar, and your reactions, your emotions, your responses to it become less unfamiliar. And so, it's not to say you need to get to a certain age before you're emotionally resilient, but emotional resilience is built on our life experience. How many of you have had relationships go sour? The first time is crushing. The second time, still crushing, but you kind of know the terrain. Third time, and it isn't that you grow hardened to it, but it becomes less catastrophic. You at least are reassured you will not die. And that type of vulnerability where you feel at risk, everything is going to be taken away, I don't know what to do, is almost like step one. And what Michael's talking about, what he's developed in that inner observer, is built over time, almost befriended over a lifetime, given our circumstances and the emotionality that we face one way or another. It goes back to the chart in terms of how important community is as well, because I believe that we develop that inner observer in relation to others by observing how others handle stress or trauma or depression. We learn something and add it into our own part, looking for it in ourselves. There's a wonderful trauma researcher that I'm fond of part of his philosophy, in that trauma is healed both at an individual level and at a communal level, and it always has been. I sure didn't grow up with that understanding. The understanding I grew up with is you handle it yourself, you're fine. And my emotional range decreased in a big way from childhood. And I spend time with my grandsons who are 3 and 8. And, if they were adults, they'd be emotional basket cases. Basically, they're uninhibited. Their emotions just are what they are. They haven't been dampened down yet in any particular way. And sometimes I feel sad around there's particular social convention that will make their lives much easier. It's the very thing that narrowed my range of emotion, is growing up that way. So that observer and explorer is important, not only to observe and to know, but also to forgive. We can never forget that we're humans, trying to find words for being human, and it's pretty hard to do that. We all speak a different emotional language. There's crossovers and similarities, but it's tough.
This is an interesting point, the idiosyncratic nature of how we relate to our emotions, and equally how we relate to the world through our emotions. How should we comfort ourselves? What should the internal witness have to say when we're confused by that, when we're being told that we're not necessarily right to feel the way that we do, and we might not be kind of sure if we're right to feel the way that we do?
I think that's where community comes in, is to have close friends or intimate friends that know you well enough that you can actually go to them and say, here's where I'm at. What do you see? Because that one perspective I can't see clearly about me is from the outside looking in, and it's incredibly valuable. And that type of questioning earlier in my life, I saw as threatening and none of your damn business. And didn't get that perspective of what I look like from the outside looking in. I don't need to adhere to it. I don't need to become that definition. But, 5 people call you a horse, saddle up. And, it's important to have that outside feedback. In my own head, I can spin any fantasy.
I see. It's a pity that community is kind of borderline illegal at the moment, isn't it? So, I mean, maybe there are other ways. Like, I just rushed over to the old esoteric library and grabbed William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience in terms of life experience, building emotional resilience. And spirituality, of course, may be something that could go in the chart there, possibly covered by meaning and community. But I do completely sympathize that we build emotional resilience, that in the challenging times, what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, and it is definitely easier to deal with second time round. But how about those points where we think that we've got no emotional resilience left? What happens then?
That does happen. People do reach the limit to how much they can bear. Seldom, I would say, in my own opinion, but that is true. I think particularly people at the end of life. I've sat hospice a lot with people who are actively dying. And what I see there is a free range of emotion. All the filters come off for some at that point, but the authentic emotion comes out at that point without the filters. And, I'd like to think we don't need to die in order to get there, or be in the actively dying process in order to get there. But it just underlines the critical nature of, at the beginning of life as children, or at the end of life as an adult. Emotions follow us through that entire time, and unfortunately in our culture we don't utilize them. The other thing on the chart, it talks about meaning or purpose. Human beings are significance making, meaning making. What's the purpose? And that's so connected to feeling too. If we're frightened of other people or suspicious of other people and isolate, meaning and purpose is going to be a lot harder to find. It's through that connection with others, service, giving of yourself, and from a stingy emotional place, that's difficult to do. So an argument could be made that without a certain level of emotional resilience, it cripples all of our relationships, not just the one with ourselves.
So let me speak to that as well, because I think it's first of all, Steve, I think it's really significant question. When you run out of a roadmap.
Sure. Well, you must deal with people all the time. They come to you and you know where they're at.
Yes, but I mean, I'm just thinking about the extremity of that. People who have nervous breakdowns, and in the famous words of Brene Brown, she thinks she's having a breakdown, but her therapist describes it as having a spiritual crisis.
Right.
And actually, in many cases, I do see, when somebody has run out of a roadmap, got to the point of like an internal implosion or explosion, and they literally are touching the bottom of the barrel, and there's only one way to go at the bottom of the barrel, and that's up. And there's something really powerful about that experience. Although personally, I've never had an emotional breakdown. I've probably had a load of other breakdowns, but where my whole system stops, I never had that. Where I've had to go into a hospital and I've had to be medicated and, and convalesce and eventually kind of pop out the other side with years and years of.
This is interesting. Actually, I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but just seeing that we talk about the nervous system, emotions being stored in it, etc. Nervous breakdown, what's the sort of medical description? Because I didn't realize that it involved a sort of system shutdown, as it were.
Well, I think that has always been, as long as I've been around, that term has been quite common. Mm-hmm. I can put another term to it, which is an existential crisis. Mm-hmm. But I think existential crisis is very different to a collapse of your nervous system.
But it's interesting, existential crisis and then a shutdown in the body.
Well, I think that I do think there is a difference between an existential crisis as well as a breakdown, nervous breakdown, or whatever you want to call it. But I think there's something to be said about having a collapse of your nervous system and you do reach rock bottom. There's only one way to go, and that's up. But the journey is a very, very slow journey. And it's a very, very focused and intentional journey because basically the individual wants to recover. Because living in that state is the most terrifying state to live in. It's almost like the collapse of the ego. That's the only other way I can describe it. That sense of no self, that sense of what's the point. So there's only one way to go up. But at least today in our culture, we do have a roadmap. And that roadmap is, what we're doing right here, talking about this phenomena, feelings and emotions, talking about vulnerability, talking about seeing the positivity in what it is that we do, talking about mindfulness, talking about what it means to live in the here and now, talking about what it means to be in community and reaching out for support. So it's quite fascinating because, I think about this environment that we're in right now. This is, in a way, it's an ecosystem for education. And it's a healthy ecosystem. And so on the basis of that, I think that a lot of these crises that we face in our lives, some of us don't have a choice but to develop emotional resilience in order to pop out the other side. And for some people, it can take days, weeks, months, and for many people, it can take years. But at least we've got to start somewhere. So within the context of what we're talking about in the question that you're asking, that is part and parcel of the journey. In other words, to put it slightly differently, our defense mechanisms are designed to protect us. But as adults, we don't need those defense mechanisms to protect ourselves. We have our wit, we have our intelligence, we have our ability to communicate. What lacks is the balance between thinking and feeling. So not being overwhelmed by feeling and not being emotionally calcified by thinking. And I think when you merge the two together, you experience, certainly in my case, liberation.
Yeah, and to validate the question you're asking too, Steve, is there are physical and biological influences into that sense of overwhelm as well. Brain chemistry can have a huge impact on that. Trauma can have a huge impact on that. Long-term pain can have a huge impact on that sense of overwhelm. And so this isn't simply an education process half as much as we are a complete system, and any one of those systems can erode or break down and put us at risk in different ways. So simply being smarter about being emotionally resilient isn't real relevant for someone who's suffering some painful form of cancer and is at the end of life. There is a finite quality to emotional resilience for some people, unfortunately, as well. And you know, what Michael's saying about ego, that's something I see a lot with military in particular. You look at someone who's had a 20-year career and they leave the combat zone, and 24 hours later, they're standing in their apartment in Chicago. How do you make that emotional shift from being under such phenomenal threat to suddenly being safe? And it's like the emotional composition that we're made up with, it takes some intention to make a shift like that. It's a whole different world requiring different emotional responses, and you're plucked from one and dropped into the other with very little transition.
You know, Snake, I think the point that you're making here is a really useful point for, I think, all of us to understand. And most of us sitting here today probably know that when men come out of the military, many of them commit suicide, many of them land up on the streets, many of them become addicts simply because they cannot cope with Civvy Street. They don't have the emotional resilience. They've become so emotionally calcified. I mean, I do like that word calcified, emotionally hard and to the point that there's actually no one home. And the only way to deal with that is to self-soothe, or of course to take their own lives. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, somehow they're just not equipped to deal with what it means to be human. And yet, of course, they're human, which is the paradox.
Well, so it's interesting because
just to say this conversation raises a whole range of new questions for me. I'll leave you with that.
Mm-hmm. It's common knowledge that oftentimes someone who begins abusing drugs or alcohol at a very early age and say lives through their 20s in that mode, when they get clean and sober, oftentimes go back to the emotional place when they started using in terms of development. And so they'll go back emotionally to 18 or when they started using. Well, that's very similar with military in that the training, the drilling, the boot camp, all those different things intend to deaden the emotions so you can respond. And it's a safety thing. And where I see, and this is no prescription, it's an observation, but what I see is that a smaller number of people come back from combat with post-traumatic stress than develop it when they come home and everything's changed and they go back to that 18-year-old and start developing because they're 40 and have had a successful career, now have an identity stripped away from them and nothing looks the same. I'm not prepared. And it's such a huge shift. And so that emotional development and having it arrested, whether it's drugs or training or the culture itself, has a huge impact. And to develop it is critical to who we are as human beings. There's purpose behind the military training. There's many different values and ethical parts that are instilled into people, as well as just deadening emotion, that are incredibly valuable. Another thing I hear oftentimes is what they miss the most about the military is feeling like someone has their back.
Jason Fox from the TV show SAS Who Dares Wins talks about this a great deal in his book, Battle Scars. Where he says that in the SAS, of course, everyone had to do a fantastic job because, you know, your other people's lives were at stake. Whereas in the office he works in after he leaves the SAS, the worst thing you can do is do a good job, because then everyone else will have to actually do something. And it's very frowned upon, that sort of proactivity and doing a good job. And he finds that very difficult to cope with.
Yeah, then even in circumstances like that, emotion doesn't disappear. You don't completely shut it out. You know, issues like watching your brother's back, service to something greater than yourself, those can be traced back to emotion as well. Or in the prisons, there's a sense of honor and respect that's highly elevated to what I see out in the culture where I live. Those are traced back to emotional, ethical behaviors as well.
What an interesting conversation.
You
You know what I'd
don't-
like to do, Steve? Did you want to say something, Snake?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I would love to get some feedback from members of the group.
Great idea, Mike.
Yeah, just I'd be interesting to know some of your thoughts and possibly even questions, but certainly your thoughts as we go deeper into this conversation.
I've been thinking that being resilient doesn't necessarily mean being reflective. And so how important it is in cultivating the internal witness is to question. And that being part of becoming conscious. I mean, I can go through a traumatic event and bounce back quite quickly, but not be reflective at all about what exactly happened. Yeah, that's just what I'm thinking about.
I like it.
Yeah.
Both are important. Yeah.
Beautifully put. Thank you.
And how can we tell the difference between reflecting in a positive way, a meaningful way, and ruminating?
Yeah, and make a distinction between obsessing too. You know, all of those things need to be differentiated in different ways. I've made a unpopular and unsuccessful argument oftentimes to have people develop emotional brakes, like the emotional brakes in a car. In other words, if you are certain that everyone is fearful and you know that about or that everyone is a threat, and you're fearful and approach everyone as fearful, and that's your emotional response to unfamiliar people, can you slow that down? Do you have the ability to know that that's a bad place to go? It's a trigger for you, and acknowledge it, but not take it off leash. And we all have different things like that.
Any other comments or thoughts from the group?
I was thinking about that. I think because what Steve was saying earlier about how do you learn to cope with your emotions or to cope in moments of crises, right? And I think what I was thinking about was, I think it takes practice. And I think just like anything. And I think if on one occasion you decide, instead of crumbling or falling into your emotions or disassociating, you actually decide to say, okay, no, I can cope with this and it's okay, and listen to your emotions and work through it. And then you realize, okay, yeah, that worked. I'm fine with that. You know, I resisted sinking under this big event. Then the next time, you know, you can do it. And so you do it again. And then in the end, it becomes more like an automatic mechanism that you trust yourself. You trust yourself to be able to cope with the crises, whatever comes your way, instead of, you know, running away from it or crumbling under the weight of it.
I mean, shame comes in here, does it, Mabel? Because we're ashamed, aren't we, of failing?
Yeah.
We're ashamed of being over emotional. We're ashamed of polluting the emotional resilience of those around us with our own lack thereof. And I think that would be kind of my question: is where do we have to step in and be concerned about others' emotional resilience, and when are we more concerned with our own?
Yeah, that gets into the whole area of codependence too. That's a tricky one. And again, it's a good illustration of what I was saying is how unique this is to each and every one of us. We each need to find the proper balance, the proper alchemy within us. Um, I'm pretty confident. I don't feel threatened by unfamiliar strangers, whatnot. It's not a threat. Whereas another person, it may have a huge emotional response to being in an unfamiliar setting like that. Part of that is experience. Part of it also is just how I'm wired and how the brain chemistry flows through me. Another thing with the military stuff is the roadside bombs have really damaged a lot of people, not just physically, but emotionally. Because even coming back to the States, a trash bag alongside the road sets them off. They're wired at a certain point to be alarmed when they see something that shouldn't be there. Even though they know full well, most likely there's not a roadside bomb in New York along the road. That instinct to react, to respond, to be alarmed is still there. And that's the tricky thing about this too, is our emotions evolve over time, both our resilience and our response to the emotion. They mature.
I would like to just, because I'm listening very intently and I'm listening for certain themes, and I think one of the things that I'm struck by is if I go back to sharing my screen and show this roadmap, what I realized that this roadmap is like a recipe.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about wanting to make a wonderful meal, and I want to experiment with something I've never made before, I have to follow a recipe. But I also have to, while cooking, and I'm speaking metaphorically, of course, while I'm cooking, I also have to taste. Well, first of all, I have to have the correct ingredients, but then I also have to taste so that it eventually suits my own palate. So it might mean that it has to have a little bit more salt, or might mean it has to have a little more sugar or a little bit more spice. But I think coming back to what Diala was saying earlier on, and I really want to support that, is that our way through the jungle, this emotional jungle that we're talking about, or this crisis, is consciousness and awareness. And Amanda Weber was also talking about, practice, which I describe as repetition. And we've got to keep making the same mistake in order to find our own way of doing whatever it is that we need to do. And we have to, and I think thematically there is something about it that is unique and it's different for everybody. So we have to find our own path. And one of the things I heard recently, which I absolutely love, and I keep repeating it, so listen to this. It was described to me that we had amateurs tinkering with our hardware and software. And, it produced me. So I am an influence of my own history. I'm shaped by my own history. I'm conditioned by my own history. But there's something about when an individual becomes, and I'm talking about myself in this case, as I've kind of very slowly but meticulously learned what is healthy and what is unhealthy for me, that has been my pathway to emotional resilience, whereby I can actually self-regulate without being overwhelmed. But it's not going to happen overnight. So all this is what I shared earlier on. It's simply a recipe for success, or it's a recipe potentially for disaster. And so there is one final thing that I want to reinforce here. There's something about, and I think you said it, Snake, and I would have loved to have picked up at the time, there's something about surrendering to something so much bigger than myself and being able to trust that no matter what happens, it's going to be okay. And it does involve the witness or the observer to reach out to reassure me that it's going to be okay, or that, well, the track that I'm on, even if I drop the ball, it's going to be okay. So it's a very delicate pathway, and there's lots of landmines. But eventually, if I stay focused, disciplined, and trust the unfolding of my own life, it's all going to be okay.
I think I'd add to that too, that, you know, what we're talking about is that integration of mind and body. To give the observer over to the mind alone is dangerous. Or to give the observer over to all the emotionality of the body without language is dangerous. The two together are meant to work together, and it's our job individually to find a language that allows them to collaborate.
But what you're talking about there is balance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sarah, but you're on mute. Sarah Jane?
I was just thinking, Snake, about what you said about emotional resilience being kind of cultivated over time of a person's life. That then makes me think about teenagers and young adults who are like in the infancy of their life experience. And I question what then I think about is, I'm 45 now, coming to all these questions and understandings more and being more curious than I ever have been, but I'm 45. It's like, I think about young people and think, how do we not implement this, but how do we help them if they're so in their infancy of their life experience, if emotional resilience is built over however many years?
Yeah, there's a couple different ways to look at that. I mean, there's an argument to be made that you need to have a certain life experience to be able to start asking the relevant questions. And at the same time, I've known many young people really benefit and get a great start by doing this work early, the self-reflective work. But it needs to be modeled. Otherwise, they don't even know it's an option. I mean, when I was a teenager,
it is being modeled, but I feel like it's been modeled on such a tiny scale in terms of what it actually needs to be to benefit everyone.
Absolutely.
And
I mean, what my preference was at 18 was fast motorcycles and cars and girls. That was it.
And, you know, Sarah Jane, you're talking about being 45 and kind of coming to these imaginings and these thoughts and theories and structures in order to have a healthier life, in order to have a healthier relationship with myself. But what about the individuals who never get there?
Yeah.
What about the individuals that, you know, they wake up at the age of 75 or even 80 and think, oh my God, you know, I've missed the boat. You know, where did it all go wrong? At what point did it go wrong? Why am I so unhappy? Why does my life have no purpose or meaning? I mean, the fact that you're here and you're asking that particular question does suggest that you're doing your work. But I think, just to reinforce Snake's response, I think it has to do with healthy role models, healthy mentors. And I know that I didn't have one as a child. That's why I made the mistakes that I made. And I had I had to find my own way through this emotional jungle. But keeping in mind what's beautiful about, you know, contemporary society, as well as technology, certainly the interweb, is that all the data, all the information is there. So there's no excuse for any of us. You know, I think about my parents, the idea of psychiatry and psychology and psychotherapy didn't even come into their frame of reference. Today, you know, as we sit here right now, there must be millions of people all over the world listening and having conversations which are not dissimilar to the conversation we are having right now on Zoom. I mean, how cool is that? And you're sitting in Minneapolis, Snake is sitting in Minneapolis. There are people sitting here from all over the world. It's so accessible today. So there is no excuse. And yet, why is the world so fucked up?
Because there can be all the information out there in the world, but if you're numb and if you're disconnected and if you're disassociated, like you're saying, Mike, until you hit the bottom of the barrel, you're not going to look.
Right.
And do we have to be a society? Generationally, are we wanting to push forward, teaching the younger generations and helping them with nothing so that they have to get to the bottom of the barrel in order to reach out? Or how it's about that implementation from what we maybe not have got generationally from our own parents and what they definitely didn't get from their parents. I do see it starting to shift and change, but I'm impatient.
Yeah, I am too. I mean, I totally understand what you're talking about. And, you know, it's like when I was young, I needed to have the answer. That was part of my ego, part of my identity was to always have the answer. And if I didn't have it, I'd make something up and argue for it. And the thought at 15 or 16 of not knowing something was not an option. And so I think younger people, as they're forming and as the emotions are beginning to happen like that, need to be educated in a bigger way, like you're saying. I don't believe we must be humbled like that. I didn't come into it until my life was a mess. And, you know, I'd, through my unconsciousness, humbled myself enough to be desperate to say, I don't know what to do. If we can encourage that type of questioning earlier on, it can only be a benefit to the younger people. And I've seen it take place. There's a young man 20 years ago who was 18 and smoking a lot of dope and painting houses and wanting to make something of his life. And I saw a couple men take him aside and make a game plan. The school, what education, what his interest was, how to build a career, and mentored him basically in his unique way of discovering what that was. It was a thing of beauty to watch that take place. And they didn't tell him what to do or make the plan for him, but facilitated his question, what do I make of myself?
Could I just pose a quick question? As someone who is, you know, a guy and an athlete who surrounds themselves with a lot of other men who play collision sports and therefore, you know, sort of similar to the military, you know, pride themselves on their, you know, their manliness or their strength. The environment within which these guys are is one of facades, let's say. A lot of the time it's, you know, having to be the manly man, so to speak. How do we sort of encourage individuals or beckon them to sort of, you know, be real and look to the emotion as opposed to, you know, maintaining that facade?
Nice question.
Yeah,
I want to respond to that because I think there's something to be said about not colluding with their mischief, just to hold them to account, to call them on it. But the problem is how do you do that? How do you have that kind of conversation? In what context is that conversation? You know, as a therapist, I remember when my ex-wife said to me, if I want to be patronized, I'll go to my therapist. We can get away with it. I can get away with it because you're paying me a shitload of money. Yeah. So as a professional, you know, I can make a comment which is patronizing, and hopefully I can even recognize it's patronizing and say, I hope that doesn't, you know, I don't want to come across as patronizing, but, you know, why don't you wake the fuck up? I mean, I'm not as blunt as that, of course, but I do think there's something difference between a professional who is working with somebody and who might be a family member or a close friend. You know, the example I love to give is, you know, I'll be working with a couple and I'll say something and the guy says, oh my God, I never thought about that. And the woman will look at him as if he's completely nuts. And she will say to him, I've been telling you that for years. Why do you have to hear that from a professional?
yeah.
I think there's something about, you know, our resistance to stepping out of the comfort zone until life itself pushes us out of the comfort zone, because they're all the alarms and the signals and the warning bells, and yet there's something to be said about our resistance to change. And if I don't make those change, life will make me change. Life will give me that opportunity, and then I have a choice whether I'm going to embrace it or I'm going to deepen my own suffering.
And I don't think we should beat ourselves up too much if we find ourselves in that position, because it's a pretty universal human condition, isn't it? That it doesn't just apply to emotions.
Yeah. And, you know, it's curious too, because, you know, one of the techniques around getting men down into their emotions and beyond numb is physical. If you can exhaust the body, you exhaust the resistance. And so after sport, after that physical exhaustion and expression, is actually a wonderful time to speak of emotion, because a lot of the guards are down. So it is odd that, I mean, I totally understand the stereotype and the dynamic. And at the same time, oftentimes facilitators are looking to take a man to complete exhaustion, physical exhaustion, knowing full well that the emotions are right under the surface at that point. I mean, it's probably a good explanation for road rage, or, you know, just losing it physically, the abuse stuff and whatnot as well, is once the body is no longer able to contain it, it just flows out. And the reaction can be varied. Go ahead, Mark.
But I mean, I hear what you're saying, Snake, but I think what I'm struck by in what you're describing is the same thing happens in the military. You know, I spent 2 years in South African military, and they basically totally and utterly exhaust you. So it's the exact opposite, where you just become a machine, you know, for something so much bigger than ourselves, which is the system.
Right.
So it's quite interesting what you're saying. Both approaches, depending on what the intention is behind them, will shape who we eventually become.
Yeah.
It's interesting, Snake, you guys mentioned exhaustion, because Way, the gentleman who asked the question, dude, I suspect this is why both of us enjoy collision sports, because it beats the crap, as in the emotional crap out of us.
It's a release, no question about it. That physicality is, you are in your body, and even if you don't have intellectual or psychological underpinnings to it, your body is still releasing that energy that's pent up. You know, the challenge maybe would be to make it more conscious. Are you emotionally decompressing when you're physical like that? Is there a component to that? And everyone answers that at an individual basis.
Well, we also see this, you know, in people who act their anger out. You know, they have their 10 or 15-minute explosion, or what I call angergasm. They feel fantastic, and it takes the rest of the family about 2 weeks to recover, and they don't quite understand that. And of course, they don't understand that is because they don't have the empathy and the awareness and consciousness to realize the effect and impact they've had on the people they love and care. And the reason for that is because I'm so disassociated from my feelings. You know, that was my own direct experience. I would unleash my anger on people around me without considering the effect and the impact. It was only when I got really comfortable with the full democracy of my feelings, that was a turning point where my ability to be empathetic and immediately apologize became accessible, because I could see the world through their eyes, not just my own, you know, egocentric and narcissistic dilemma. I feel very passionate about this.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions or comments that people want to make? Because it feels like these are rich. This has a richness to it in itself. Well, you're all just sitting there stunned. Go ahead, Mark, and then you next, Amanda.
Yeah, hi. Given that we know the importance of emotional resilience, when do you think it'll become mainstream early on in schools or colleges? Because to avoid it, we're just prolonging the cataclysmic disaster that will happen. And we are in a position now, knowing what we know, to begin to assist people, and yet we still do not do it. And I understand the worker bee educational system, but is it still part of that?
You know, I know a few programs around that, but one that's been very successful is an outfit out in San Diego. They've got several different places around where they're actually working within the schools, you know, with teenagers around emotional resilience and mentoring. And it's been very successful, particularly right now with so many split up families. You've got a mother's influence or a father's influence, maybe not both. Mother and father is a complicated relationship. To have someone outside the family who takes an interest in you and introduces this emotional component to living a life is tremendously valuable. The organization is called Boys to Men, and they actually work within the high schools out in California. And it's been a very successful program. But they're few and far between, you're right.
Yes. Well, it's in the UK, that's not entirely true, because there are many organizations who are working in that particular field, Mark. The only problem is that the education funding for programs like that to take place in school don't exist. They haven't allocated funds. So it's not like they don't exist. They certainly, I know they exist in the UK because I'm in touch with some of them. So, you know, until the education board and government takes what we're discussing seriously, we're just going to go round and round in circles. And, you know, you said something else, Sarah Jane, that you're impatient. I've been impatient for like 45 years. And eventually it will go mainstream, but it's just going to take time. It's a massive, massive problem in our culture.
The cost is more by waiting.
Don't even think about the cost. You know what it costs to keep a person in our prisons in the UK? Anything, a young offender, anything between 150 and 250,000 pounds a year. Mm-hmm. One of our young offenders institutes have over 700 young offenders. Multiply that by, let's say, 200,000 a year. That is the kind of money that can go back in to education. Yeah. But keeping in mind, as somebody said, which I really like, is before you become a politician, you've got to be in therapy for at least 7 years. In fact, I don't even call politics, I call it politricks. Mm-hmm. Because that's what it is, trickery. That's sleight of hand.
There's another part to your question too, is unfortunately, a lot of the programs with decent funding are grounded in psychology and something being broken rather than education. Mm-hmm. And there's a stigma around that.
Yeah.
Is if at 15, you're convinced that you're broken and need to work on yourself, that's a very different thing than you're uneducated in learning. And so I think that needs to be integrated into it too, because everything we've spoken about today is about education. Certainly not a syllabus and a curriculum, but the education of being human. We're all cursed with it.
That's a really perceptive insight, Snake. It's the difference between eating brown rice and being tubby.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So guys, any more questions out there from the wisdom seekers? So Mike, Snake, anything more you want to say just to sum up?
I tell you, I had a conversation with you yesterday, Snake, and you introduced that word impervious, which is not a word I knew, but I know we haven't really touched on that, but I would appreciate you just coming back to the difference between impervious and flowing. I mean, would you be able to comment on that?
Yeah. what it was in relation to is this emotional resilience, is that one of the goals is to be permeable, not impermeable. In other words, to allow the emotions to soak in, have a place within yourself rather than blocking them. You know, an example of the military might be we're instructed to block emotions that may get in the way and cause an unsafe situation. That's impermeable. Nothing will soak into that. So it was in that context that a big part of emotional resilience is being flexible rather than brittle, being permeable instead of impermeable. So it was in that context. And again, like everything else we've talked about today, resilience is built on seeking that ability. You know, it's numb is unacceptable, brittle is unacceptable. Both are very difficult ways to live life. We're almost forced to be resilient by the constant challenges that come up in life. Might as well give into it and become adept and somewhat graceful with what goes on inside us. It's not broken, but we haven't developed a language with it. And that takes being open, fluid with it.
The
and
forgiving
forgiving.
Ends in the wind. Sorry, Snake.
Yeah. And forgiving, I added. Yeah.
I raised that yesterday, Steve. You know, the moment that Siddhartha experienced enlightenment was when he was rowing across the Ganges and he saw the difference between three types of reeds. One, which had already snapped because it was too rigid, and it became brittle through the wind. And when it snapped, of course, it died. And the other one was the reed that was just bending with the wind. And so another way of putting impervious would be to flow, to become permeable. Wow, what a conversation. What a conversation.
So my closing remark would be, and I do just want to share the screen, to be honest. I'm not sure if I've got the
you do.
To.
You do.
So I can share can I share the screen? Is that my screen shared?
Absolutely, go ahead.
Is it working?
Yeah.
I can't see it.
No, I don't. I can share the screen. So we'll just have to do without my closing anecdote. I'm afraid, guys. I'm really sorry. It was a visual one. So we heard a lot there about emotional resilience, guys. Thank you. And the points that I was picking up on was, firstly, trying to put ourselves in touch with our positive, instinctual inner voice, which you guys call the internal witness or the internal observer, which is the sensible voice sensible enlightened voice that's beneath our tumult of thoughts and confusion and fear. And you guys also mentioned sort of life experience and how that can build emotional resilience, and how trauma is not all bad, as ghastly as it feels when we're in the heat of it. And you also spoke about liberty in the existential crisis. I was going to put up a picture of the goddess Kali. Mike trumped me with his Siddhartha quote there. I was going to put up an image of the goddess Kali, who's the very popular one, you know, with all the arms, who's got a frightening face, and she's always trampling on the body of a man, and the man is looking up with a benign and peaceful expression. And this is because his ego has been dissolved by Kali. And once the ego is dissolved, of course, one can find a place of peace.
There she is, Ma Kali.
So just on the right, you can see her trampling there on poor old Shiva. But the idea behind that image is that, yes, once the ego is destroyed, there is a certain amount of tranquility that comes with that and being at rock bottom. It almost makes you want to be back at rock bottom sometimes.
What
So
an interesting association.
Particularly point.
Yeah, beautiful association.
So everyone, thanks so much for joining us. Christmas is coming up, although I gather the office parties are being cancelled, so to speak.
In Downing Street.
And but you can get out there, you can download our new 2021 remixes of our Keep Your Cool kits. We've got our regular Keep Your Cool kit that's been updated for this year. And we have our niche Keep Your Cool at Yule kit, which is for coping with the additional stresses and strains of the Christmas. As long as that doesn't get cancelled again as well, of course. We are back at the end of January, where we're going to be talking about, what was it, Mike, the January podcast?
What was it, Snake?
Yeah, I'll bat it over
to Snake. The one that comes up for me, and I've been thinking about this, is rupture and repair.
Well,
you know, both within the context of relationship, conflict, rupture and repair, but also within ourselves.
Sounds fascinating.
That's one of 100 different topics we've talked about. So,
and people will be able to read about that in advance of the podcast, because Snake's going to write another one of his enviously elegant, light touch, much more elegantly written than mine, blogs on the subject. And that'll be up in the next couple of weeks, I imagine.
Yep.
We've also got a 10-week BAAM group online course starting in January. And on March the 22nd, we have a weekend intensive course in person happening just outside of London. Head over to angermanage.co.uk and you'll be able to get the details on those and download those new Keep Your Cool kits. Everybody have an absolutely wonderful Christmas. If you get angry this Christmas, you can just say to everyone, it's cool to be angry. It's trendy to be angry. Anger management. The Kardashians are doing it. Wayne Rooney's doing it. Ricky Gervais is doing it. You know, if you're not angry, then whatever.
Okay.
No, don't do that, by the way. Keep your cool at Yule kit out and use the techniques there. Do not become defensive and pretend that rage is cool. Everyone, thank you so much. Have a fantastic Christmas and thank you for your support in 2021.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Happy Christmas.
Thanks so much for coming. Wisdom Seek.
Thank you very much.
Merry Christmas. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.